When we first saw the house, I knew it was perfect. 2 stories of faded brick with large windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. The backyard had tall oaks that offered cool shade in summer. The neighborhood was peaceful, quiet. Exactly what we needed after 2 years of hospitals and rehabilitation centers. My son Eli deserved a real home after everything he had endured. The accident had changed everything. One moment he was a typical energetic 14-year-old racing down a hill on his bicycle. The next moment, our lives were shattered by screeching tires and the horrifying sound of impact. The doctors said he would never walk again. What they did not tell us was how much strength remained in his mind, how his intellect would sharpen while his body healed, how he would pour himself into books and learning during those long, painful months of recovery. I remember the day we signed the mortgage papers. Eli sat in his wheelchair, beaming with excitement. "Our new beginning," he said. I believed him, I truly did. The real estate agent mentioned there was a homeowners association, but assured us they were reasonable people who just maintained property values. I nodded, not giving it much thought. We were too focused on the modifications we would need: wheelchair ramps, widened doorways, adaptive bathroom fixtures. The first week was wonderful. Neighbors brought casseroles and introduced themselves with polite smiles. But I noticed how their eyes lingered on Eli's wheelchair, how their expressions shifted slightly when they saw our modifications taking shape. The contractor installed a gently sloping ramp at our front entrance, replacing the 3 steps that would have made access impossible for Eli. We added motion sensor lights along our walkway to help with navigation at night. That was when the letters started coming. The first one was almost friendly. "Dear new resident, we notice you have made exterior modifications without prior approval. Please submit proper documentation to the HOA board." I immediately filled out the forms, attached our contractor's plans, and included a brief note explaining these were necessary accommodations for my disabled son. 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one was signed by Mrs. Patricia Griffin, HOA president. "While we sympathize with your situation, the ramp design is not aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. Please submit alternative plans." I called Mrs. Griffin directly. I explained that the ramp was the least steep design possible while remaining functional. She listened in cold silence before responding. "Rules are rules, Mrs. Chen. We have standards to maintain. Perhaps you should have considered that before purchasing in our community." The conversation ended with my hands shaking. I found Eli in his room, surrounded by textbooks. He had always been bright, but since the accident, he had become voracious in his consumption of knowledge, especially anything related to law, debate, or civil rights. I did not want to burden him with adult problems, but he saw right through my forced smile. "They are giving you trouble about the ramp, are not they?" he asked. I sat on the edge of his bed. "How did you know?" "I saw the letter, and I noticed Mrs. Griffin taking pictures of our house yesterday." I sighed. "I will handle it, do not worry." Eli gave me that look, the one that made him seem decades older than 16. "Let it go for now. We have more important things to focus on." The next day, another violation notice arrived, this time about our mailbox, which apparently was 2 inches taller than regulation. Then it was the motion sensor lights, deemed too bright and disruptive. Each letter contained veiled threats about fines and compliance hearings. At night, I would catch neighbors slowing down as they drove past our house, pointing and whispering. Once I overheard someone say, "Property values will tank if they turn this into some kind of facility." I tried to shield Eli from it all, but he noticed everything. He spent more time in his room, reading legal texts and taking notes. When I asked what he was studying, he simply said, "Just preparing for the future." One evening, as I was helping Eli prepare for bed, he looked up at me with determination in his eyes. "Mom, promise me something." "Anything," I said. "Do not give this house up. No matter what they say or do, this is our home now." I nodded, but my heart was heavy. The latest letter from the HOA had included a thinly veiled threat. "Continued noncompliance may result in legal action." I had no idea how prophetic those words would become, or how completely they would underestimate the quiet, wheelchair-bound boy they were trying to drive away. The harassment escalated with frightening speed. What began as passive-aggressive notes transformed into daily torment. The fines started at $50 for unapproved exterior modifications, then $100 for excessive outdoor lighting, $200 for the ramp that violated aesthetic guidelines. They claimed our mailbox created a safety hazard. They insisted our wheelchair-accessible walkway disrupted the visual harmony of the street. I spent hours drafting appeals, attaching doctor's notes and disability accommodation laws. The responses were always the same: denied. The HOA board maintained a united front behind Mrs. Griffin, a steel-haired woman in her 60s who ruled the neighborhood like a small fiefdom. Her smile never reached her eyes when we encountered each other. She always made a point to speak loudly and slowly to Eli, as if his wheelchair somehow affected his hearing or intelligence. The true cruelty revealed itself in early summer when I took Eli to the community pool. He had been looking forward to it for weeks. Swimming was one of the few physical activities where his disability did not hold him back. We arrived with our pool passes and sunscreen, only to be stopped by the attendant. "I am sorry, but he cannot come in," the young man said, avoiding eye contact. "Excuse me, we are residents, here are our passes." The attendant looked uncomfortable. "New policy. Safety concerns. You would need to file for a special exemption and have it approved by the board." Eli's face remained expressionless, but I saw how his hands tightened on his wheelchair armrests. "What specific safety concerns?" he asked calmly. "I just follow the rules, kid. Take it up with Mrs. Griffin." We left without arguing further. In the car, Eli was silent, staring out the window. I could not hold back my tears. "I am so sorry, honey. This is not fair." "No," he agreed. "It is not, but fairness can be created where it does not exist naturally." His words surprised me. There was something in his tone, a quiet certainty that I had never heard before. The following week, I attended the monthly HOA meeting, determined to address these issues publicly. The meeting was held in the community center, a room filled with about 30 neighbors seated in neat rows. Mrs. Griffin presided from a table at the front, flanked by 4 board members who nodded in unison at everything she said. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I raised my hand. Mrs. Griffin's smile tightened as she acknowledged me. "Yes, Mrs. Chen, what is your concern this evening?" I stood, hands trembling but voice steady. "I would like to discuss the accessibility issues my son and I have been experiencing. The denial of pool access, the fines for necessary disability accommodations." Mrs. Griffin interrupted. "Those matters have already been addressed through proper channels." "But they have not been resolved. These accommodations are protected under federal law. This is a private community with established guidelines that you agreed to when purchasing your property." Her voice remained pleasant, but her eyes were cold. "Perhaps this neighborhood is not suitable for your particular situation." A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in agreement. "Are you suggesting we should move because my son is disabled?" I asked, disbelief rising in my throat. "I am suggesting that if you cannot comply with our standards, you might be happier elsewhere." She smiled at me as if she had just offered helpful advice. "Now, moving on to the next agenda item." I remained standing. "This is discrimination." The room went silent. Mrs. Griffin's smile vanished completely. "That is a serious accusation, Mrs. Chen, one you would be wise not to make without legal representation." She looked around the room. "We are simply enforcing bylaws that maintain our community standards and property values." I drove home in tears, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I walked in, I found Eli in the living room, waiting. "It did not go well," he said. "It was not a question." "They want us gone, Eli." I collapsed onto the sofa. "Maybe we should look at other neighborhoods. I do not want to keep fighting. I do not want you to have to live with this constant hostility." Eli wheeled himself closer, resting his hand on mine. "No. No. We are not leaving. This is our home." He gestured to the stack of papers on his lap. "I have been researching. Everything they are doing violates federal law, the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. They cannot legally force us out because of my disability. I looked at my son, really looked at him. In that moment, I did not see a disabled teenager. I saw a young man with fierce determination and intelligence burning in his eyes. "What should we do?" I asked. "Give me 2 weeks. Let me build our case, trust me." The next day, we received a formal complaint letter from the HOA's attorney. It detailed every violation, demanded immediate compliance, and threatened court action within 30 days. I nearly called a real estate agent right then. But when I showed the letter to Eli, he simply nodded and added it to his growing collection of evidence. "Perfect," he said. "They are creating the paper trail we need." "For what?" His smile was calm but determined. "For when we fight back." For the next 2 weeks, Eli transformed his bedroom into a war room. Books on disability law, housing regulations, and civil rights covered every surface. His computer screen displayed court cases and legal precedents. He filled 3 notebooks with meticulous notes, diagrams, and strategy outlines. I brought him meals at his desk, watching in amazement as my 16-year-old son built what looked like a professional legal defense. "Are you sure about this?" I asked one evening, setting down a plate of dinner beside his keyboard. Eli looked up, dark circles under his eyes but fire in his gaze. "More sure than I have been about anything since the accident. They think they can bully us because they see me as weak. They do not realize that sitting in this chair has given me thousands of hours to read and learn while other kids were running around." He handed me a stack of papers. "I finished our response letter. We should send it tomorrow, certified mail." I skimmed the document and my jaw dropped. The letter was 15 pages of detailed legal analysis, citing specific HOA bylaw contradictions, federal ADA violations, and housing discrimination statutes. It methodically dismantled every citation against us, provided legal precedents supporting our position, and demanded the immediate cessation of all discriminatory practices. "Eli, this is incredible. Did you write all this yourself?" He nodded. "I also found examples of selective enforcement. They have never cited the Petersons for their basketball hoop, which violates the same height restrictions they used against our mailbox. The Johnsons have landscape lighting identical to ours, but they have never received a violation notice." "Should we hire an actual lawyer to review this?" I asked. "Not yet. Let them underestimate us first," he smiled. "Actually, do not mention that I wrote this. Let them think you hired someone." The next day, I mailed the response letter with a simple cover note. "Please find our formal response to your complaints. We hope to resolve this matter without further escalation." For 3 days, nothing happened. Then Mrs. Griffin appeared at our door. Her face was flushed with anger as she held our letter. "Where did you get this?" she demanded without greeting. "Good afternoon to you too, Mrs. Griffin," I said calmly. "Did you actually hire an attorney? Because this reads like legal intimidation." I maintained a neutral expression. "I simply responded to your complaints with relevant information." She glanced past me into the house, where Eli sat reading in the living room. Her eyes narrowed before returning to me. "This changes nothing. The board has reviewed your response and found it insufficient. We are moving forward with legal action." After she left, Eli wheeled himself to my side. "What did she say?" "They are taking us to court." To my surprise, Eli smiled. "Good, that is exactly what we wanted." "It is, Eli, we cannot afford a lengthy court battle." "We will not need to. The courtroom is where their power evaporates. Everything will be on record under oath, subject to actual legal standards rather than their made-up interpretations." 1 week later, we received the official summons. The HOA was suing us for multiple violations and seeking an injunction to force the removal of our accessibility modifications. The court date was set for 3 weeks away. I began researching affordable attorneys, but Eli stopped me. "Mom, I need to ask you something important," he said one evening. "What is it?" "I want to represent us in court." I stared at him. "Eli, you are 16. I know I cannot be our official attorney, but legal codes in this state allow non-attorney family members to speak on behalf of relatives in certain civil matters. I have checked. This qualifies. But these people have hired actual lawyers with degrees and experience. And those lawyers know nothing about disability law. I do. I have spent every day since the accident learning it. He took my hand. Trust me, let me try. Looking into his determined eyes, I realized something important. This fight was not just about our house anymore. It was about Eli reclaiming his power, finding his voice. After 2 years of having decisions made for him, procedures done to him, limitations imposed upon him, he needed this. Okay, I said, but we prepare together. For the next 3 weeks, our dining room became our strategy headquarters. We rehearsed arguments, anticipated counterpoints, organized evidence. Eli worked with methodical precision, constructing a case so thorough it left me in awe. My son, who had lost so much, had discovered a gift I never knew he possessed. The night before court, I found him staring out his bedroom window at the quiet neighborhood street. Nervous, I asked. No, he said thoughtfully. For the first time since the accident, I feel like I have purpose. Like maybe this chair is not just what happened to me, but what positioned me to fight not just for us, but for everyone who faces discrimination. I hugged him tightly, tears in my eyes. Whatever happens tomorrow, I am so proud of you. He smiled. They have no idea what is coming. The county courthouse was an imposing stone building with wide steps leading to tall wooden doors. Ironic, I thought, as I helped navigate Eli's wheelchair up the access ramp at the side entrance. Inside, the courtroom was all polished wood and somber formality. Rows of benches were already filling with spectators. I recognized many neighbors, curious about the outcome. Mrs. Griffin sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 other board members and their attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing our way with thinly veiled confidence. The attorney shuffled papers importantly, barely acknowledging our presence when we settled at the defendant's table. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Harmon entered, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Once everyone was seated, the proceedings began. The HOA's attorney spoke first, presenting their case with practiced precision. He described us as willful violators who had disregarded community standards and diminished neighborhood aesthetics. He showed photographs of our ramp, our lighting, our mailbox, presenting each modification as if it were an eyesore rather than a necessity. The defendants have repeatedly ignored notices and warnings, he concluded. We simply ask the court to enforce compliance with bylaws these homeowners agreed to when purchasing the property. Judge Harmon turned to us, and who speaks for the defense? I stood nervously. I do, Your Honor, Catherine Chen. Are you represented by counsel, Mrs. Chen? No, Your Honor, but I would like to request that my son be permitted to speak on our behalf for portions of our defense, as allowed under state code for family representation. The judge looked surprised but nodded. That is permissible, though unusual. You may proceed with your opening statement. I cleared my throat and began the statement Eli and I had practiced. Your Honor, this case is not about mailbox heights or lighting fixtures. It is about a homeowners association that has systematically targeted a family with a disabled member through selective enforcement and discriminatory practices. As I spoke, I could see the judge's attention drifting. The HOA's lawyer looked bored, checking his watch. Mrs. Griffin whispered something to another board member who smirked in response. After my shaky introduction, I turned to Eli. I would like my son to present our evidence if the court permits. Judge Harmon nodded. All eyes turned to Eli as he wheeled himself forward. At 16, he looked small behind the massive wooden table. Mrs. Griffin actually had the audacity to roll her eyes. Then Eli began to speak. Your Honor, my name is Eli Chen. I became paralyzed from the waist down 2 years ago after being struck by a car while riding my bicycle. His voice was clear, steady, and surprisingly authoritative. Since then, I have had to adapt to a world not built for people like me. The modifications to our home are not aesthetic choices. They are necessities that allow me basic dignity and independence. He pulled out a binder of organized documents. I would like to begin by establishing a pattern of discriminatory enforcement by the plaintiffs. For the next 20 minutes, Eli methodically presented evidence that left the courtroom in stunned silence. He showed side-by-side photographs of identical violations that went uncited on non-disabled residents' properties. He presented a timeline of harassment that began precisely when our disability accommodations became visible. Furthermore, he continued, the HOA bylaws themselves contain multiple provisions that directly contradict the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. He cited specific sections, explaining legal nuances with the confidence of a seasoned attorney. I watched the judge's expression transform from polite patience to genuine interest. She began asking Eli clarifying questions, which he answered with precision and depth of knowledge that clearly surprised her. The HOA's attorney interrupted. Your Honor, while this is all very touching, the defendant is clearly reciting information provided by someone else. This young man cannot possibly understand. Actually, Eli cut in, if counsel has specific questions about the legal precedents I have cited, I would be happy to elaborate on any of them. Perhaps we could start with Harbor Point Limited v. Saniford, which established that HOA aesthetic requirements cannot supersede reasonable accommodations. The attorney blinked, caught off guard. He had no follow-up. Judge Harmon leaned forward. Please continue, Mr. Chen. Eli wheeled himself closer to the bench. Your Honor, the most concerning evidence comes from the HOA's own meeting minutes. He produced copies of official board meeting transcripts that a sympathetic neighbor had provided. As you can see, on March 12, Mrs. Griffin specifically referred to our home as that wheelchair house and discussed ways to, quote, encourage them to relocate elsewhere. On April 23, board member Thomas Wilson suggested, making compliance so expensive they will have no choice but to move. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Griffin's face had gone pale. The other board members looked at their attorney in alarm. Additionally, Eli continued, I have emails from Mrs. Griffin to other board members explicitly discussing how to use HOA regulations to target our disability modifications. He presented printouts of emails where Mrs. Griffin had written, we need to be careful not to mention the disability directly. Stick to aesthetic violations and property values. The judge's expression hardened as she reviewed the documents. Where did you obtain these emails, Mr. Chen? They were provided to us by a former board member who resigned in protest of these actions. The HOA's attorney jumped to his feet. Your Honor, these documents were obtained without authorization and should be excluded. They were provided voluntarily by a recipient of the emails, Eli countered. There is no expectation of privacy in communications distributed to multiple parties. The judge nodded. I will allow them. Eli continued presenting evidence for another 30 minutes. He showed video from our doorbell camera capturing board members measuring our ramp and laughing. He played audio recordings of phone calls where Mrs. Griffin had told my voicemail that people like your son would bring down the whole neighborhood. With each piece of evidence, the mood in the courtroom shifted further. Neighbors who had come expecting a minor dispute about bylaws were witnessing something far more disturbing. The HOA board members stopped whispering among themselves. Their confident smirks had vanished completely. Finally, Your Honor, Eli said, I would like to address the legal remedies available under the ADA and Fair Housing Act. He cited specific statutes and penalties for willful discrimination. These laws exist specifically to prevent the kind of targeted harassment my mother and I have experienced. We ask not only for dismissal of all HOA claims against us, but for the court to consider appropriate damages for the emotional distress and clear civil rights violations we have suffered. When Eli finished speaking, the courtroom was absolutely silent. The judge studied him with what looked like genuine respect. Thank you, Mr. Chen, she said. That was most illuminating. She turned to the HOA's attorney. Counselor, do you have any response to these allegations? The attorney conferred frantically with his clients. Mrs. Griffin was whispering urgently, her face flushed with anger. Finally, he stood. Your Honor, we request a 30-minute recess to review these unexpected materials. Judge Harmon checked her watch. Granted, court will resume in 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, I embraced Eli. That was incredible, I whispered. Where did you learn to speak like that? He smiled. I told you. While everyone else was playing video games, I was reading law books. It gave me purpose after the accident, something I could still do, maybe even better than before. Across the room, I caught Mrs. Griffin staring at us with a mixture of shock and dawning fear. She quickly looked away when our eyes met. For the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I felt something more powerful than anxiety or anger. I felt hope. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The HOA board members huddled close to their attorney, their earlier confidence replaced by tense whispers and worried glances. Mrs. Griffin's perfect posture had wilted slightly. Their attorney approached the bench with a stack of hastily prepared notes. Your Honor, he began, his tone noticeably more subdued. While we acknowledge the defendant's concerns, we maintain that the HOA has acted within its authority to enforce community standards that all homeowners agreed to upon purchase. Judge Harmon fixed him with a steely gaze. Counselor, I have reviewed the evidence presented by the defense. The emails from your clients explicitly discussing ways to target this family because of their disability accommodations are deeply troubling. Those emails are being taken out of context, Your Honor. Then please provide the appropriate context, the judge replied. The attorney fumbled through his notes. The board has legitimate concerns about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. And how exactly does a wheelchair ramp impact property values? The judge asked. Studies have shown that non-standard modifications can. What studies? Can you cite them? The attorney could not. Judge Harmon turned to Eli. Mr. Chen, you mentioned having additional evidence regarding discriminatory intent. Eli nodded and wheeled himself forward again. Yes, Your Honor. I would like to present evidence showing selective enforcement of HOA bylaws. For the next 40 minutes, Eli methodically dismantled the HOA's defense. He showed photographs of at least 12 homes with violations identical to those we had been cited for. Unapproved landscape lighting, mailboxes of non-standard heights, even front yard modifications more extensive than our ramp, none of which had received violation notices. Furthermore, Eli continued, I have statements from 5 other residents who were granted immediate approval for modifications similar to ours, but who do not have disabled family members. The judge turned to the HOA attorney. How do you explain this discrepancy in enforcement? The attorney conferred with Mrs. Griffin, who whispered urgently in his ear. He stood, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, the board evaluates each case independently based on multiple factors. What factors specifically led to approving the Andersons' front yard water feature, but denying the Chen's wheelchair ramp? The judge pressed. I would need to consult the specific documentation for those decisions. The documentation is right here, Eli said, sliding forward another folder. Both applications were submitted in the same month. The Andersons' approval took 3 days. Our denial took 2 days. The only substantial difference was the purpose of the modification. Judge Harmon reviewed the documents, her expression growing increasingly severe. Mr. Chen, what damages are you seeking for these violations? Eli straightened in his wheelchair. Your Honor, we are seeking the following. First, immediate approval of all accessibility modifications currently installed at our property. Second, a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from further discriminatory enforcement. Third, damages under the ADA in the amount of $25,000 for emotional distress and deliberate violations of federal disability protections. Mrs. Griffin gasped audibly. The board members exchanged panicked looks. Additionally, Eli continued, we request that the court mandate disability awareness training for all HOA board members, and that Mrs. Griffin be removed from her position due to her demonstrated pattern of discrimination. The HOA attorney jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The board members are volunteers serving their community. Mrs. Griffin has led this HOA for 15 years with distinction. Perhaps that tenure has led to certain complacency regarding federal law, the judge observed dryly. Mrs. Griffin could contain herself no longer. She stood abruptly. This is absurd. We have worked tirelessly to maintain the quality and character of our neighborhood. We cannot allow every exception that comes along just because someone claims special needs. The courtroom fell silent. Her words hung in the air, damning in their naked prejudice. Judge Harmon's expression hardened. Mrs. Griffin, I strongly advise you to let your attorney speak on your behalf. But Mrs. Griffin was beyond caution now. Everyone wants exceptions. If we allow one ramp, soon there will be all manner of structures and modifications. Property values will plummet. Is that fair to everyone else who bought homes expecting a certain standard? Eli spoke quietly but clearly. The Fair Housing Act exists precisely because people determined fairness meant excluding those who were different. The law recognized that true fairness sometimes requires reasonable accommodations. Mrs. Griffin glared at him. And now we are supposed to take legal advice from a teenager. This is clearly being orchestrated by someone else. No 16-year-old could possibly understand these matters. Judge Harmon looked at Mrs. Griffin with thinly veiled disgust. Mrs. Griffin, you appear to be making the same mistake that has landed you in my courtroom, underestimating this young man based on your own prejudice. Mrs. Griffin's face flushed deep red. She sat down abruptly. Her attorney looked like he wanted to disappear. Your Honor, he said weakly, may we request a brief recess to confer with our clients? Judge Harmon checked her watch. You may have 15 minutes. As they filed out, I squeezed Eli's hand. You are doing amazingly, I whispered. He nodded, his eyes focused on Mrs. Griffin's retreating back. They are going to offer a settlement, he predicted. How do you know? Because they realize now how exposed they are. Their attorney knows they could lose much more than $25,000 if this goes to judgment. When court resumed, the shift in the HOA's approach was immediately apparent. Their attorney approached with a conciliatory expression. Your Honor, my clients would like to propose a settlement agreement. They are prepared to approve all current accessibility modifications to the Chen property, waive all pending fines, and pay $15,000 in damages. Judge Harmon looked to us. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, what is your response to this offer? I looked at Eli, who shook his head slightly. I stood, Your Honor, we respectfully decline the offer as presented. The HOA attorney looked stunned. Mrs. Chen, I strongly urge you to reconsider. This is a generous offer that resolves your concerns. Eli wheeled himself forward. Your Honor, the proposed settlement addresses only our individual situation. It does nothing to prevent similar discrimination against other residents with disabilities in the future. Judge Harmon nodded thoughtfully. What would make the settlement acceptable to you, Mr. Chen? 3 additions, Your Honor. First, a legally binding amendment to the HOA bylaws explicitly protecting disability accommodations. Second, mandatory disability awareness training for all current and future board members. And third, Mrs. Griffin's resignation from the board. Mrs. Griffin gasped. That is outrageous. You cannot force me to resign. The judge raised her hand for silence. While the court cannot directly mandate a resignation, it can certainly consider the full range of evidence presented when making a judgment, including the particularly troubling emails and statements made by Mrs. Griffin. She looked pointedly at the HOA attorney. Counselor, I suggest you confer with your clients again. Given the evidence presented, they may wish to reconsider their position. Another tense 15 minutes passed as the HOA board huddled with their attorney. I could see Mrs. Griffin gesticulating angrily while the other members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, they returned to their table. Your Honor, their attorney began, my clients agree to the terms proposed by the defendants, with the modification that Mrs. Griffin will voluntarily step down from her position as board president, effective immediately. Judge Harmon looked to us. Is this acceptable to the defendants? Eli nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Very well, I will review the settlement agreement once it is drafted. Court is adjourned for today. As the judge left the courtroom, the gallery erupted in murmurs. Several neighbors approached us, some offering congratulations, others expressing shock at what they had witnessed. Mrs. Griffin stormed out without looking at anyone, her face rigid with humiliation. I put my arm around Eli's shoulders. You did it, I whispered. You actually did it. He looked up at me with tired but triumphant eyes. We did it, Mom, together. The formal settlement was signed 3 days later. Every term we had requested was included. Approval for our modifications, payment of damages, amended HOA bylaws, mandatory training, and Mrs. Griffin's resignation. As we left the courthouse with the finalized documents in hand, I felt a weight lift that I had been carrying since those first violation notices arrived at our door. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some residents seemed embarrassed to have been silent witnesses to the discrimination. Others expressed shock at what had been happening behind the scenes at board meetings. A few die-hard supporters of Mrs. Griffin gave us cold shoulders, but they were decidedly in the minority. The local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Teen Legal Prodigy Takes on HOA Discrimination and Wins." A reporter called requesting an interview with Eli, which he agreed to after careful consideration. The interview took place in our living room. The reporter, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, had covered disability rights issues before and approached the story with sensitivity and intelligence. Eli, she asked, what made you decide to fight the HOA rather than comply with their demands? Eli sat tall in his wheelchair, looking more confident than I had seen him since before the accident. It was never really a choice, he replied. Compliance would have meant giving up my independence and dignity. The ramp they wanted removed is my access to the world. The lighting they called excessive is what keeps me safe when navigating at night. Where did you learn so much about disability law and housing regulations? She asked. After my accident, I had a lot of quiet hours in hospital rooms and during recovery. I started reading about disability rights because I wanted to understand what protections existed for people like me. He smiled slightly. I never expected to put that knowledge to use in a courtroom, but I am glad I was prepared when the time came. What would you say to other families facing similar discrimination? Eli thought for a moment. I would tell them that discrimination often relies on isolation, making you feel alone and powerless. But there are laws protecting you, and you are stronger than you think. Document everything. Learn your rights. And remember that standing up for yourself helps others who might face the same treatment later. The story was published the following weekend. By Monday morning, Eli had become something of a local celebrity. The phone began ringing with calls from other families dealing with similar issues, seeking his advice. One call particularly stood out, from Marcus Goldman, a partner at Goldman, Rivera and Associates, one of the most respected civil rights law firms in the state. I was impressed by your son's understanding of disability law, he told me. We would like to offer him an internship position this summer. Our firm handles many ADA and fair housing cases, and we believe Eli could contribute meaningfully while gaining valuable experience. When I told Eli about the offer, his eyes lit up with a brightness I had not seen since before the accident. Really? They want me, even though I am still in high school? They specifically asked for you because of what you did in court, I said, fighting back tears of pride. Mr. Goldman said your analysis of the ADA violations was better than what he sees from many first-year associates. The internship would begin in 2 months. In the meantime, the changes in our neighborhood were immediate and striking. The day after the settlement was announced, 3 board members personally came to our door to apologize. They looked genuinely ashamed as they explained that they had gotten caught up in Mrs. Griffin's leadership and had failed to question her targeting of our family. The most surprising visit came from our next-door neighbor, Michael Peterson, who had been one of the more vocal critics of our modifications. I wanted to say I am sorry, he said awkwardly, standing on our front porch. My cousin has MS and uses a wheelchair sometimes. I never made the connection between what you needed and what she needs. He glanced at our ramp. The truth is, I was worried about my property value because that is what Mrs. Griffin kept saying, but watching your son in that courtroom, he shook his head. I was wrong, and I am sorry. Eli accepted these apologies with grace that amazed me. There was no bitterness in him, no desire for further retribution. People fear what they do not understand, he told me later. Education is more effective than anger. 2 weeks after the settlement, we received a letter from the new HOA president, David Wilson, inviting Eli to consult on updated accessibility guidelines for the community. Your expertise would be invaluable in helping us create truly inclusive policies, he wrote. The day Eli wheeled himself into that HOA meeting room, the same room where I had been humiliated months earlier, I felt such a profound mixture of pride and vindication that I could barely contain my emotions. The board members listened attentively as my son explained reasonable accommodation standards and presented his recommendations for community-wide accessibility improvements. Judge Harmon called personally to congratulate Eli on the settlement and to ask if he had considered a future in law. In 30 years on the bench, she told him, I have rarely seen such a clear, compelling presentation from someone without formal legal training. You have a gift, young man. That evening, as local news crews set up in our living room for a follow-up segment, I watched my son prepare for the interview. He adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and positioned his wheelchair at the angle we had practiced, confident, professional, but still authentic. Are you nervous? I asked. A little, he admitted, but mostly excited. This story is bigger than us now. Maybe it will help other families stand up for themselves. The reporter asked him about his future plans. Eli looked directly into the camera, his voice clear and certain. I plan to become a civil rights attorney specializing in disability law, he said. Not for revenge or because of what happened to us, but because I have seen firsthand how necessary these protections are. Nobody should have to fight for basic dignity and accessibility, but until that day comes, I want to help those who do have to fight. When the cameras stopped rolling, the reporter shook Eli's hand. You know, she said, we get a lot of stories about conflicts and problems. It is rare that we get to report on someone who turned adversity into such a positive force. You should be proud. I caught Eli's eye across the room, and the smile we shared contained everything words could not express. Pride, yes, but also healing. For the first time since the accident, I saw my son fully present in his life again, not defined by what he had lost, but by what he had discovered within himself. As the news crew packed their equipment, Eli wheeled himself to the front window, looking out at our home's exterior. The ramp that had started all this trouble now gleamed with fresh paint in the evening light. It is strange, he said softly. They thought that ramp was something to be ashamed of, something to hide, but now I see it differently. He turned to me. It is not just my way in and out. It is a statement that people like me belong here too, that we have the right to access the world just like everyone else. I put my hand on his shoulder, and together we looked out at the neighborhood that had tried to reject us but would now never forget us. 6 months after our court victory, our lives had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The settlement money allowed us to make additional accessibility modifications to our home. A state-of-the-art bathroom with adaptive fixtures, an elevated garden bed so Eli could pursue his interest in growing herbs, a specialized desk that accommodated his wheelchair perfectly. But the physical changes paled in comparison to the changes in Eli himself. My quiet, introspective son who had retreated into books after his accident now radiated confidence and purpose. His summer internship at Goldman, Rivera & Associates had been extended into a part-time position during the school year. 3 afternoons a week, he worked with their disability rights team, reviewing cases and providing insights that the senior partners increasingly valued. Letters arrived almost daily from families facing similar discrimination, not just from HOAs, but from schools, employers, and public facilities. Eli answered each one personally, offering guidance and resources. He started a blog documenting accessibility issues and legal remedies, which quickly gained thousands of followers. One Wednesday afternoon, I arrived home from work to find Eli in an animated discussion with Mr. Goldman in our living room. "Mom," Eli called excitedly as I entered, "Mr. Goldman has a proposal." The attorney stood to greet me. "Mrs. Chen, your son has been an exceptional addition to our team. His analysis on the Westridge School District case helped us identify a pattern of ADA violations we might have missed." I smiled proudly. He has always had a gift for seeing patterns. "Indeed, which is why we would like to formalize his role at the firm. We are proposing to sponsor his education, a pre-law track through undergraduate studies, then law school. In return, he would commit to joining our practice afterward." I looked at Eli, whose eyes shone with excitement. "Is that what you want?" "More than anything," he replied. "I have found what I am meant to do." That evening, after Mr. Goldman left, Eli and I sat on our back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The oak trees that had first attracted us to this home swayed gently in the breeze. "I received an email from Mrs. Griffin today," Eli said quietly. I tensed. What did she want? "To apologize, actually. She said she has been doing a lot of thinking since the case. Her sister was recently diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and now needs a wheelchair sometimes." He shook his head at the irony. "She said she now understands what we were trying to explain all along." "Do you believe her?" Eli considered this. "I think adversity changes people. Sometimes it takes experiencing something personally to develop empathy." He smiled slightly. I told her I appreciated her message and wished her sister well. His capacity for forgiveness continued to amaze me. Where I still harbored anger toward those who had tried to drive us away, Eli had moved beyond it to something greater, a vision of how things could be better. The following week, a local news station did a follow-up story on our case. The reporter interviewed several of our neighbors about the changes in the community since the settlement. "It has opened a lot of eyes," said David Wilson, the new HOA president. "We have completely revised our approach to accommodations. In fact, we are now working with a disability rights consultant to make our community pool and clubhouse more accessible." Another neighbor, an elderly woman named Ruth Martinez, spoke about how the improved lighting along walkways, similar to what we had been cited for, had made it safer for her to walk her dog in the evenings. "These changes help everyone, not just people with disabilities," she said. "I do not know why we resisted them for so long." Mrs. Peterson, whose husband had apologized to us months earlier, admitted on camera that she had been one of those who had complained about our modifications. "I was wrong," she said simply. "Watching that young man in court changed my perspective completely. He taught our whole community an important lesson about looking beyond our assumptions." When the segment aired, my phone buzzed continuously with messages from friends and colleagues who had watched it. One text particularly touched me, from Eli's physical therapist. "I always knew he was special. Now the world knows too." That night, as I helped Eli prepare for bed, a routine we had shared since the accident, I found myself overwhelmed with emotion. "What is it, Mom?" he asked, noticing my tears. "I am just so proud of you," I said. "When the accident happened, I was so afraid for your future. I worried about what kind of life you would have, whether you would find happiness and purpose." I squeezed his hand. "I never imagined this." "Neither did I," he admitted. "For a long time after the accident, I felt like my life was over, like I had lost everything that mattered." He gestured toward his wheelchair. "But now I see that this chair led me to my calling. If I could go back and prevent the accident, I honestly do not know if I would." His words stunned me. "Really?" "The accident closed some doors, yes, but it opened others I never would have discovered otherwise. How many 16-year-olds know exactly what they want to do with their lives? I do. How many get to make a real difference in people's lives? I have." The wisdom in his words left me speechless. My son had transcended his trauma in a way I was still learning to do myself. The following morning, as Eli wheeled down the ramp that had started our battle, our neighbor Mr. Johnson waved from across the street. "Eli, The neighborhood council approved your proposal for the accessible playground equipment. Construction starts next month. Eli's face lit up. That is great news, thank you. He had proposed adapting the community playground to include equipment accessible to children with mobility issues, a project the new HOA board had enthusiastically supported. You have transformed this neighborhood, I told him as we drove to school. We transformed it, he corrected me. I could not have done any of this without you standing beside me. I thought about how far we had come. The house that was supposed to be our fresh start had become exactly that, but in ways we never could have predicted. The neighbors who had once whispered behind our backs now greeted us with genuine respect. The HOA that had tried to drive us out now consulted Eli on inclusion policies. And that wheelchair ramp they had fought so hard against? It had become a symbol of something powerful, not disability but determination, not accommodation but transformation. They had mocked my son, dismissed him, underestimated him at every turn. They never saw the genius behind the wheelchair. They never realized that in trying to break us, they had only made him stronger. As I watched Eli wheel confidently into his school, greeted by classmates who now looked up to him, I thought about the long journey ahead. College, law school, a career fighting for others. The road would not be easy, but I had complete faith in his ability to navigate it. They had mocked my disabled son, never suspecting he was a legal genius in disguise. Their ignorance had been our greatest advantage, and his brilliance would now become a light for others finding their way through darkness. That ramp they had hated so much now stood as our monument to victory, not just for us, but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong.